Assassin's Creed Syndicate, perhaps one of the series' more overlooked titles, releasing between a critical sandwich of Assassin's Creed Unity and Assassin's Creed Origins. While this game certainly didn't fly under the radar, it was never properly equipped to enjoy making any kind of extensive impact. Set in Victorian London with the Industrial Revolution in full swing, Syndicate's mandate was never to be the best Assassin's Creed ever made. Rather, its purpose was to consolidate Unity, to polish that system and deliver an experience not dissimilar but certainly not as broken. And considering Ubisoft's background commitment to change the series forever from Origins going forwards, Syndicate was incredibly unusual. This was the first Assassin's Creed game to feature dual protagonists. There was a noticeable departure in tone from the norm, for something more light-hearted and comical. With the game being set at an advanced point in human history, the game can no longer rely on the dueling setup of good old-fashioned sword fights for its combat system and instead opted for something more brawler-oriented, for better or worse. The parkour system was subsidised with a grappling hook that at times bypassed that system altogether, and the game introduced rudimentary driving mechanics with horse-drawn carriages. And outside of the game itself, this was the first time Ubisoft Quebec would take the helm at developing an Assassin's Creed title. And all of this came at a time when the Assassin's Creed formula had seemingly run its course. I of course promised the shot of a dead horse is a coincidence.
What's going on over there?
I remember this game coming out like it was yesterday. I remember the month-long wait between the console releases and the PC launch, and to an extent I recall firing this game up for the first time, soaking in that first playthrough, and just remember being grateful that it wasn't anywhere near as mangled as Unity initially was. But as time cracked on and one playthrough became two, and then three, as we waited for a year longer than usual for the next Assassin's Creed release, to my mind, the cracks began to manifest. The game's sense of humour quickly rubbed me the wrong way, and the game ultimately felt like a parody of the series it belonged to. The light-hearted tone overall felt taboo in a setting that, if anything, wanted to be darker, gloomier. It irked me the game felt a need to introduce historical figures with unnecessary lower thirds as if we hadn't figured it out, as our characters often purposelessly bumped into them. And of course, when you try to shoehorn societal issues of the mid-19th century into video game content, it's incredibly easy to fall into a trap of that delivery being reductive, if not entirely uninsightful. Assassin's Creed Syndicate was not without its flaws, but 2015 was 10 years ago now, meaning Assassin's Creed Syndicate later this year will be turning a decade old. While I have nothing better to do in January, I thought I'd revisit it, exploring what it did well and what it didn't so much. In part because with time, just like people themselves, opinions can change, but also just because I fancied it. So consider this my 10 years on video on Assassin's Creed Syndicate, in case I'm just a bit too busy later on this year to do it. And I suppose as good a place to start as any would be with the setting. Now there's certainly a debate to be had as to whether this game's placement in time was a stroke too modern for Assassin's Creed, but let's, even if only momentarily, remove ourselves from such a redundant train of thought and take Victorian London as it is. The Victorian city of London was, for its time, the de facto centre of the world, the heart of the booming British Empire, with Assassin's Creed Syndicate taking place in 1868, when Britannia dominated a good 10 million square miles of the world. And this game wastes no time showcasing how, despite all that might and wealth, precious little of it trickled down to the layman. Syndicate shows us a city where poverty is rampant and working conditions are poor. A world where the welfare of the many is lost in the raging machine of progress, the average individual's living conditions are squalid, and society's underclass is worked into a grave. The end result is abundant misery and crime, accented both by an impossible class divide, where the wealth of this mighty empire rested in the hands of a few, and the rapid modernisation of the world. A time of change, prosperity and strife in equal measure, depending of course on who you ask. It was a world constantly twisting, turning and changing, and when you put it that way it sounds like the perfect period for an assassin to be operating. And so, despite the constraints that come from being so close to modern times, yes, Assassin's Creed Syndicate's Victorian setting was a good setting for Assassin's Creed. And Syndicate taps into the nature of its setting immediately. and while there's certainly a reverse point that'll come up in the discussion of the story beats, I think it's fair to at least say the game's placement in space and time is not ill-conceived. Away from that, like Unity before it, Assassin's Creed Syndicate's open-world focus is one city. I always found the cities in Assassin's Creed to be most compelling when they were all there actually was, because the entire map is part of the city. You can see it extend beyond the borders to parts of it that you can't actually go to because there's no point. In that setup, there's absolutely no need to exaggerate the scaling down in order to make a city's existence within the game possible. There's also absolutely no margin for failing to do it justice, and the result is a skyline of endless chimneys, rooftops, and landmarks, highly detailed and thick with atmosphere that helps sell this setting as feeling authentic. Whether you're walking among the streets or soaring across the rooftops with your grapple hook, this cityscape of Victorian London is something to get lost in. It's a tight world space, bustling with activity. Even the River Thames is rife with both static and moving parts that allow you to cross it in 1,000,001 ways, and it's that activity, or very illusion of activity, that lends any Assassin's Creed city that air of validity. You get different districts that boast different points of interest, showcasing different calibers of architecture and a variety of differing lifestyles. It's apparent when you're in a poorer or wealthier district, demonstrating to us that those from all walks of life call the capital of this empire, upon which the sun never sets, home. London as portrayed in Assassin's Creed Syndicate has an element of believability, and at least superficially it's as compelling as a backdrop can get. Off the back of recently having played through Assassin's Creed Origins, where the negative space of the desert is handled quite nicely but the cities feel somewhat flat, at least by comparison to the likes of Unity and Syndicate anyway, and as I can currently replay through Assassin's Creed Valhalla, that on the city front, while it addresses it to an extent, has a lot of the same issues as Origins. To say the urban environment of Syndicate is refreshing to me would be an understatement. If you ask me, this is the format where Assassin's Creed is best equipped to thrive. It lends itself better to being tighter and more focused, and doesn't force the game to have to be something else entirely for huge chunks of it, as the metropolitan-oriented core gameplay loop isn't by default being starved of everything that gives it depth. That's something the RPG Assassin's Creed titles struggled with so intensely, they actually gave up, instead striving to become something other. They aren't entirely deprived of their Assassin's Creed moments and other redeeming qualities before you throw a shoe at me or something, but I just find Syndicate's setting and the setup of that setting to be much more compelling for the franchise it belonged to. But you're right, of course, in saying that simply being the game before what Assassin's Creed was meant to be dissolved into the ether isn't actually a redeeming quality, it's just Assassin's Creed trying to be itself, and naturally you'd fucking hope so. But of course, with that no longer being the reality we have with this franchise, hindsight has allowed my perspective of this game's individual setting to soften somewhat. That's not to say I don't have my gripes, I think the overall tone is a bit funky. In my head I pictured Victorian London as a bit darker, and those images that were leaked by Kotaku back in like 2014, 2015, before this game was even announced under the codename Assassin's Creed Victory, it seemed that dark tone would be there, but as far as the base game is concerned, not including the Jack the Ripper DLC, which is an unhinged bit of downloadable content, but I'll cover that in its own video, Syndicate opts for a lighter, more jovial tone, which I think is a symptom of being a Ubisoft Quebec title, as that's always been more their thing than, say, the more serious tone that Ubisoft Montreal Assassin's Creed games often possessed. So this game's depiction of London is hardly thick with the smog of misery, and considering the context of the setting, that feels like a missed opportunity. There was certainly more room to play around with a variety of vibes, and that doesn't entirely go amiss, but being light-hearted by default did feel like a strange choice. And then of course there's the fact that despite this world being beautiful to gaze upon, I don't think Syndicate put enough stock into its interactivity. For instance, though you can enter a few pubs throughout the city, there may be a bottle to collect, but you can't walk up to the bar and sink a pint, which would have been nice, which I understand from my perspective as a resident of the UK is the same as a trucker winding down by playing Euro Truck Simulator. But the point is, I don't think that this game nor its world does enough to put emphasis on vicariousness. However, I will reserve my broader critiques for the side content for when we actually get there. Now, creating the world is one thing, but we still need the vessel through which we experience it, the vehicle we use to move through it. and that comes in two parts in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, as rather than simply having one main protagonist, we have the Fry twins, Jacob and Evie, two already established members of the Assassin Brotherhood, two very differing personalities, portrayed by Paul Amos and Victoria Atkin. And this was an interesting shake-up to the single protagonist dynamic of previous Assassin's Creed titles, as our time across the game would be split between these two vessels, as opposed to simply soaking in the entire thing from the perspective of one individual, or, as seen in previous Assassin's Creed games like 3, shifting from one character to another at a certain point. Now that is a bit of a gamble. Rather than having us connect with one character, the game now needs to have us connect with two, which naturally takes twice the effort. Does Syndicate make twice the effort? No, and instead falls into the trap that many stories of this setup sort of do, where the characters are one character in effect, they just present opposite aspects. Jacob is the brash, reckless brawler. His approach to problem solving is very direct. He's witty, aggressive, impulsive, reckless, and according to Ubisoft on social media, bisexual. That was a pretty blatant point scoring exercise, to be fair though, as that never really comes up in the game. Don't get me wrong, I'm aware of the scene that spurred the discussion, but that discussion was not the intent of the scene, was it? Ubisoft's chronic inability to disguise their corporate behaviour has always amused me. But back to what can actually be discerned in the game. Jacob is the embodiment of matter over mind, with his preference being tailored towards action over deeper philosophical thought, and as a result he prefers a good scrap to any form of stealth.
What's all this? Which one of you is responsible?
Who are you? The sanitary inspector. This man is dead.
While this doesn't always impact gameplay, Jacob is narratively dismissive of the bigger picture, leaving the pursuit of pieces of Eden, for instance, to his sister. In other words, his personality can be summarised in his liking for punching people. He is simply a personification of a destructive playstyle that's been present in Assassin's Creed since day one. Evie, on the other hand, is far more tactical and methodical, with her speciality being more stealth-oriented. Like I said, the gameplay impact is minimal, but she's clearly portrayed as a firm believer in the Creed. She represents the stealthier aspects to Assassin's Creed gameplay. Therefore, her personality and approach is the exact opposite to that of Jacob's. However, despite their clashing personalities and their opposing approaches to completing their objectives, they have common motivations. And that primary motivation is to make for London and liberate it from the pesky Templars. It's a rather simple motivation as far as they go, but it gets the job done, and the establishment of these characters is how the game begins. They run off to London without the Council's permission, and that only gets brought up as a joke once.
Well, thank goodness the Council saw reason and sent you to aid us.
Yes. Thank goodness.
Once in London, Jacob and Evie Fry get to work, linking up with good old Henry Green, who gives us something of an ungodly exposition dump, which gives Jacob Fry the idea for pitching this game's gimmick. With the Templars in control of a gang called the Blighters in London, and there's only one gang for some reason, Jacob decides to form an opposing gang.
We'll call ourselves the Rooks.
Evie thinks it's a terrible idea, but lets Jacob do it anyway because we need the gimmick of gangland warfare to sell the game.
We will free London from Starrick. You have my word.
Am I Rooks?
I really don't understand this game's need for portraying Jacob as a childish goofball, one that Evie and Henry are completely ignoring here, as if A, he isn't capable of turning London into a war zone, and B, doesn't fully intend to do exactly that. It doesn't strike me as an awfully assassin-like thing to be so blatantly doing, but hey ho, that's exactly what we've got to do. And it's at this point, I mean after we've randomly bumped into Charles Dickens for absolutely no reason.
That Mr. Fry was Charles Dickens.
Yeah, thank goodness for the entirely necessary lower third, or I'd have never guessed, where the game introduces us to the gang shenanigans. London needs liberating from the pesky Blighters, who are of course in cahoots with the pesky Templars, and borough by borough we can take the fight to these thugs in a plethora of ways. First of all, we have the good old-fashioned assassination of targets. You really can't go wrong with these, you just kill a dude and leave. It's as simple as it gets, and I can't really fault it. And then of course there are gang strongholds where we have to take out a bunch of Blighters in a restricted area as expected really. It's hardly original for Ubisoft. They aren't too tricky, they have caveats and optional objectives. They're far from inspired, but that doesn't necessarily make them unsatisfying to do when there are only so many in the entire game. We're also introduced to a 10-year-old named Clara O'Day who contracts us to go and liberate children, who at the time were also subject to having to work. Now these child liberation missions are a bit ridiculous because they don't really pay any consideration to the context behind the social issue of child labour in the 19th century. It's reduced simply to blitzing a factory, killing their boss and rendering them unemployed. Congratulations children, we've left you financially up shit creek without a paddle until somebody else comes along to exploit you. At the surface level, we're doing a very good thing, so that's all the game cares about. But it's a missed opportunity to explore one of the time's more rampant issues, where there's a lot more depth to it than merely children working is bad. Sure, that's probably the right end message, but it's not a wrong we can right in gameplay content without grossly oversimplifying it. So, instead it's portrayed as a misdeed of the Blighters and by extension, the Templars, which is just hollow by comparison to more interesting commentaries that could have been made here. Yes, of course, an argument can be made for the children then going under the employ of the Rooks led by Jacob and Evie, where they enjoy better conditions and higher pay, which, though not an ideal situation, is certainly a better one than the one we find them in. But don't worry, the Rooks will take care of them off-screen is not the elaboration this needed. Rather, that positive impact needed to be seen, or taking it at its absurd face value, retains its validity. This simply needed a more involved opening mission that explains what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, and how the liberation of these children is only the beginning of how we're helping them. Because without all of that crucial context, it is nonsensical. And finally, through policeman and jack of all disguises Frederick Aberline, we have the kidnap missions. Now, I don't think you could come up with a more hateful activity if you tried. Good old Freddy here wants us to go and arrest some criminals. So, just like with the assassinations, we need to infiltrate a restricted area, but instead of killing our target, we have to kidnap them, with the game kindly providing us with a mechanic for doing that. What we do is press a button to grab our target and then move extremely slowly towards a carriage, and the challenge is to remain undetected. The slower you're moving, the smaller the detection circle. Then we've got to bundle our target into the carriage and take them to a pickup point where the incompetent policeman will take them the rest of the way. On the one hand, this was a new thing to do as far as Assassin's Creed is concerned, but it loses its footing when you realise the game will let you kill your target and just simply take his body if you really can't be arsed. And all Frederick Aberline will do is sound a bit depressed about it.
I despise being delivered corpses.
There aren't meaningful consequences to choosing murder over apprehension simply because it's easier. So as soon as I got bored of doing the kidnap missions, I simply started killing people. And sure, you fail an optional objective in doing this, but that's really not a meaningful consequence.
Good lord. No man deserves that fate.
You're a police officer, either arrest me or shut up. Yet on top of being able to completely engage with this activity wrong, it does cast doubt on Frederick Aberline, whether that be his competence or his moral compass, in delegating his job to a crazed murderer like myself. This is a really strange hurdle to stumble on for a game that created an entire cast of fictional villains to avoid causing offence to the living descendants of historical figures from the time. Yes, the man was famed for seemingly being out of his depth in the Jack the Ripper murders 2 decades after Syndicate's setting, but in order to land that job I doubt he was a hopeless helmet his entire career. But let's move off of this minor point. Once every district of a borough has been liberated, we finally gain access to the cherry on top, the gang war. This first one has a bit more to it than the others being part of the story, but gang wars typically go as follows. This man, whose identity is never explained, gives us a rundown of the situation in the borough, and then we, with our trusty Rooks in their disgusting green coats, briefly scrap with the naughty Blighters in their menacing red coats, an encounter that lasts mere seconds before the borough leader shows up and we have to fight him too. This doesn't take anywhere near as long as the first one does, it's just a simple scrap in most cases. This one's atop a moving train, which is always cool, and the fight of course ends with our primary target dead. These gang wars aren't ill-conceived, they're just not very excitingly executed. The actual brawl of them lasts seconds at the best of times, and considering you get an opportunity to kill the borough leader before that brawl, that is sometimes all there actually is. Should you succeed in killing a gang leader before the brawl itself may at times end as soon as it begins. And this gets worse the later you leave it as you upgrade both yourself and your gang. So in this liberation setup we have moments where the game refuses to punish you for engaging with the activities incorrectly, and moments where the game actually punishes you for engaging with the activities a bit too well. Nonetheless, the sequence that introduces us to all of this serves its purpose quite well in introducing us both to the caveats of Assassin's Creed Syndicate's gameplay that carried over mostly from Unity, and establishes the Rooks as the Fry Twins gang. And then on top of that, as a reward for taking out Rexford Kaylock, yes, that's his name, Syndicate does have a thing for over-the-top names at times, we get his train as our hideout. An assassin bureau on the rails. I get why they did it, the game is after all set during the Industrial Revolution. Trains are kind of the icon of the Industrial Revolution, so having a hideout on a train is a good way to make sure that you see them often. They haven't exactly had much screen time in Assassin's Creed up until this point. I think one showed up in the modern day for Assassin's Creed 3. However, logically it would make no sense to hide on a train because you know where it is, or at least where it's going to be, and where it can go. And of course, when it stops in a station, what's stopping people from just getting on and seeing things? But look, because trains are cool, I'll give it a pass. I shall suspend my disbelief on this. Anyway, with that introductory sequence squared away, let's explore some of the gameplay systems. Traversal-wise, the gameplay is basically Unity minus the flashiness. There are no more parkour twirls and things like that, it's all purely what's functional. But the thing that really transforms how the game plays in this respect is the grapple hook. This thing allows you to both quickly scale tall buildings and zip line from rooftop to rooftop, which is incredibly useful, especially if the rooftops are too far apart to simply jump between. A common issue in Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Now, the positive side to the grapple hook is it's incredibly useful. Without it, I don't think the parkour system in Assassin's Creed Syndicate would truly function just based on how the buildings are laid out. However, the unfortunately negative perspective is it bypasses the parkour system. With it, you're either on a rooftop or you're not. The game feels less of a need to layer its verticality to give you pathways up, not that it doesn't altogether. Knowing full well you'll probably just press L1 and be on the top of the rooftop in a matter of seconds. It's both convenient and useful, and you can scale Big Ben in under a minute, but it oddly takes priority over the broader parkour systems, which is really weird when the parkour is built on Unity, which is no slouch. That being said, the rope launcher, as it's called, has plenty of uses. It allows for you to avoid touching the ground in widespread built-up areas, but not only that, quickly using it to dart to a rooftop is a great means for escape and also allows you to cross wide open spaces and reach targets from above. As far as tools go, yes, it may overshadow the actual parkour system, but yes, it is incredibly handy. It also does have limitations. For instance, there's no descend feature. So to do that, you'll have to rely on parkour down, finding an enemy to swiftly air assassinate or performing a leap of faith. It also has no combat function, though it could easily have been blagged to have one. And there's no swinging on the ropes like Spider-Man either, as suggested by this picture from the Assassin's Creed Victory leaks before the game was even announced. Furthermore, just because you have this tool doesn't mean you necessarily have to use it all the time. You might fancy a good old-fashioned clamber, and more power to you. But altogether, this grapple hook has both its positives and negatives. An Assassin's Creed parkour purist might argue that its implementation is a symptom of the setting not being ideal for Assassin's Creed, but I think at the very least it deserved a go to see how it handled, and that's what Syndicate does. And considering no other entry in the series utilises it, it just becomes a part of Syndicate's identity. And while I'd argue the game is more reliant on it than it perhaps should be, I do quite like it. Now, let's talk a bit of combat. Considering Assassin's Creed Syndicate is set at a time where the traditional sword fighting as seen in previous Assassin's Creed entries is becoming increasingly taboo, in favour of merely shooting each other and calling it a day, this game does the right thing and opts instead for a more brawler-oriented system. It's fast-paced and looks a bit like it's been fast-forwarded, but I do think there's a value in Syndicate's combat setup. It's basically a series of hits and dodges, where those dodges may very well turn into counters depending on how much health your enemy has, and your objective is to take out your enemy's health bar and finish them off with a nice finisher move. It's quite straightforward really, it's just a bit choppy and erratic, the hits don't feel like they have as much impact as they should, and that can make it feel at times somewhat unsatisfying if I'm being entirely honest, but as you level up and acquire better gear it does begin to even out, even if at no point does the combat really lose its flair of being tongue-in-cheek. There are 3 kinds of weapons that can be used in the combat: Brass Knuckles, the Cane Sword which I used with Evie, and the Kukri Blade that I thought suited Jacob. I don't think your choice here affects the flow of combat all that much, it just changes the animations, which, you know, is nice for variety's sake. I didn't use the brass knuckles much, because they're the same animations as you get with the bare knuckle fighting in the ring, so for the sake of encompassing all 3 weapon types, I just left it at that. Now, it would appear the premise of the combat is to get as high a combo as possible. It can be tricky at times with the combat moving at such a rate that you have to really be on it to react to everything. However, if there's one thing I do appreciate, it's multi-kill animations wherever they crop up. You can of course take out foes one by one, but if you want to double them up, you can. You can even take out 3 in one animation, or indeed 4. Now, activating them can be a little bit tricky as they have to be highlighted, or sometimes they don't. It really does not specify how they're triggered, and having 4 enemies in that sort of state of combat where they can be taken out doesn't necessarily mean that you will be able to do it for some reason. So it would appear getting the quadruple takedown animations is purely up to the gods or something. That being said, these multi-kills are still worth trying to go for, if only to spice up the animations a bit. Although I will say, considering the pacing of the overall combat, some of the animations feel like they take a fiscal quarter, and that can be incredibly jarring as everyone else just waits for you to roll their mates up into a spliff. Eevee's specialised finisher animations in the small margins where there's actually a difference are certainly worse for this, but it doesn't necessarily heighten the risk of the flow of combat being compromised by you simply taking too long on an animation you have no control over. It just feels at times that the animations can be so slow that they should in fact do that, even if that would be unfair against the player. So at times, especially the longer multi-takedown chains, could have done with being a bit more rapid, but considering the rest of the combat system has its moments of absurdity, it's hardly the end of the world. There is also ranged weaponry, with throwing knives being better suited towards stealth, but guns being more suited towards Jacob's loud and proud approach, for instance. And not only do we have access to this weaponry, sometimes our foes do as well, so there's a proper mixture in there of having to avoid being shot, which does work out at dodging bullets, however unlikely that is, but overall either way it is an added dimension to the combat system. So to summarise the combat, it's alright, it could have been better, but it also could have been worse. As for stealth, Assassin's Creed Syndicate borrows its stealth systems from Unity, obviously. I didn't find the crowds to be as dense as Unity's as to facilitate social stealth to that extent, but staying out of sight and picking off your enemies one by one is certainly more than possible. In fact, in many instances, it appears to be encouraged. There are plenty of opportunities and tools available to aid you in remaining undetected, and being the more refined younger sibling to Unity, there are less bugs that might cause you to be detected through no fault of your own. I do find it somewhat irritating that having your hood up depends on whether or not you're crouched, but otherwise I can't really fault this game's approach to stealth. I wouldn't have minded seeing more instances where social stealth was viable, not just good old-fashioned stealth. As while it's far from altogether absent, it doesn't really find itself factoring into the mission layout all that much. Of course it does have its moments, but it is few and far between, with infiltrations typically being in restricted areas rather than just because your enemies are looking for you specifically, so there aren't a great many opportunities for a crowd to exist around what's going on. But before I go on to sound like a used car salesman, as social stealth is abundantly more present in this game than it was in Origins, where it wasn't at all, or indeed Valhalla, where the idea of being a blade in the crowd is facilitated, the crowd just doesn't exist, I'm going to be quiet about it. That being said, there isn't a right lot else to say about the stealth in Syndicate. It works perfectly well, and despite the social aspect not being integrated in the most dynamic way, black box missions, for instance, that constitute the assassinations of the main storyline, do reward you for being stealthy. They may not be anywhere near as in-depth as people like to pretend they are, but in both Unity and Syndicate, they've always had a thing for rewarding you for taking your time, exploring the options made available to you rather than simply running in and killing your target, and unlocking that satisfying, unique assassination opportunity. And doing things this way, i.e. playing these black box missions correctly, does rely on at least some modicum of stealth. So some mind has been paid to ensure that stealth is rewarding. That being said, it doesn't mean you can't be detected throughout these missions. Rather, detection doesn't mean everyone is suddenly alerted to your presence. If you find yourself being detected in an enclosed space, only those immediately around you will know where you are. Therefore, you can find yourself returning to stealth after dealing with that problem. Being detected does not mean things spiral out of control, and it becomes a part of the flow of the gameplay. This ability to flow between stealth and combat and back again is as integral to Assassin's Creed arguably as the systems themselves. And of course, yes, it's absolutely worth taking your time, being patient, and unlocking that unique kill opportunity. After all, you can peel off the chain of events that leads to that at any point and just simply take out your target if that's what you fancy, but following it through to the end is just so much more satisfying.
Corpses do not help. Boots?
Well observed. Aside from that, the black box missions are also a positive for stealth based on their presentation. You have to figure out a way in, you have to figure out a means to get to your target, and you have to figure out a way out. And of course there are multiple avenues for which, however the unique kill opportunity is still optional. That being said, not utilising it at times can feel like a soft fail state, as it's the only real thing that's truly unique about any given black box mission. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, it just encourages you to actually utilise the stealth in sometimes elaborate ways. And should you demonstrate the patience that requires, the game rewards you.
Now then, let's discuss this like... Good God! Who the bloody hell...
Oh, shut up.
Now, oddly for these black box missions being so stealth-oriented, most of them are carried out by Jacob, who's the more combat-oriented character. Of course, like I said, in gameplay terms, it really doesn't make a right lot of difference, but considering he's meant to be the brawler that likes nothing more than a good fight, it's weird that the game constantly puts him in situations where stealth is still the best bet, encouraging players to choose to disassociate from his character. Worse yet, having that sort of be the canon choice. As for Evie, who's meant to be the stealthy one, I think throughout the entire game she gets 2 assassinations, one of which being her introduction, the other being her infiltration of the Tower of London. Now I get that she's meant to be more methodical, cautious, investigative and stealthy, and her missions overall have more complexity to them than simply killing people, but considering her preference for subtlety, true bearing on the gameplay notwithstanding, I think she should have had a better share of the assassination black box missions, because taking the time to work towards those unique kill opportunities is really something better suited towards her. In a way that how we're supposed to believe these characters operate doesn't feel quite as tailored towards Jacob, but nonetheless Jacob is the one doing them more often than not. And then you can engage in the more combat-focused game content as Evie if you so wish to. And the overall point I'm trying to make is the game tries to compartmentalise these 2 aspects to a playstyle into 2 entirely different characters, and then doesn't really do that. I'll say this much, it doesn't work to the gameplay's detriment, whether that be stealth or combat. In fact, if they had successfully compartmentalised stealth from combat, I think it would be far worse. But the gameplay highlights this schism between the 2 characters as entirely non-existent, ultimately rendering splitting our time between these 2 characters as flawed. The skill tree is another great example of where this difference is ill-pronounced, because there are differences. Later on in the game, they have skills unique to each character, but otherwise the skill tree is exactly the same. You earn the skill points for both equally regardless of who you're playing as, and then you have to invest them in the same skill tree separately. This means that yes, you can tailor the early game build to initially suit the characters in a different way, but as you get towards the back end, before you get to the unique skills, you're likely to pass through a threshold of homogeny. You can't even really try to stormroll to the back end skills as there are level gates. And leveling up is dictated through investing enough skill points, so you may very well find yourself with the currency to purchase these late game skills, but if you aren't at that level, you'll need to invest them elsewhere first in order to gain access to these abilities later, at which point most of the game's probably in the rearview mirror. In other words, the acquisition of skills may as well be handled universally. Rather than having to upgrade Jacob and Evie independently on identical trees, it may as well just be the one for both. There is a little bit of mobility in it being separated between 2 of them, but it will inevitably hit a point of being same-ish, as aside from 3 different skills each towards the back end of the game, the entire thing is pretty much identical. Better yet, I think Jacob and Evie should have had entirely different skill trees, complete with entirely different skills from top to bottom, because it would justify investing the skill points twice over a little bit better, and also give infinitely more depth to the distinction between the 2 characters and how they operate. In other words, the investment of skills in this game highlights a gaping missed opportunity for differentiation between Jacob and Evie in a gameplay sense, as had they each had more skills unique to them, I think it's fair to say a lot of the issues surrounding them playing largely the same would clear away to a much higher standard. By comparison, only having 3 unique abilities each is rather underwhelming. The other upgrade system, being the gang upgrades, does the job. I don't have any criticisms there. I'm also fairly happy with the small selection of gear upgrades and the customization this game boasts. This was also the first game to include a numbered level. Thankfully, it's rudimentary by comparison to the RPG titles, and though it functions in a similar way by gating certain areas behind higher levels, there is some leeway, and heading into a higher level area than you are currently doesn't necessarily mean instant death. The system's setup is very much so to gauge your progression, but also to gently, more than anything else, direct you towards the areas that the story is presently taking place in, more than likely. And the number only goes up to 10 anyway, so it's not a huge thing. While I don't understand its need in Assassin's Creed as such, I don't think this actually gets in the way of enjoying Syndicate at any point, and if anything, it gets across what it's trying to accomplish, and the skill trees do allow you to unlock more in-depth gameplay the further into the game you go. The failure to use this system to distinguish Jacob and Evie aside, the use of the level system does work in ensuring that playing the first hour doesn't necessarily mean you've played the entire game, if you know what I mean, and so in that respect it does overall accomplish what it broadly set out to do. As for other gameplay loose ends worth mentioning before we move on and talk some story, after playing Origins and being in the middle of a Valhalla playthrough, I never thought I'd miss a good tailing mission, but here we are. Then of course there's the hijacking and driving of carriages. Simply put, a driving mechanic, but instead of having cars, you have horses. Considering Unity had no mounts at all, it was nice to see something included here. I would have liked to just have a horse, but I do of course understand the appeal of this. You can lay waste to the street as you go, you can just randomly start running people over as well, which is really strange for an assassin to be doing, but hey. This system being present ultimately does provide some gameplay that is unique to Syndicate, and above all else it just becomes one of those things that makes this game stand apart. All in all, to wrap the discussions of gameplay up, Syndicate for the most part follows suit with what Unity does. It adds its own flair with implementations such as the grapple hook, the driving of carriages, the kidnap missions, I guess, and overall just tries to deliver an experience that's cleaner. When on rooftops, this does unfortunately mean it does hold your hand a bit, with the parkour for instance being infinitely fonder of gluing you to a surface than it perhaps should be, which can at times make fiddling with it a bit tricky. But all in all, the systems accomplish what they set out to do, and that's the main thing. Now, let's of course talk some story bits. Rather than give you an entire rundown of the narrative for this one, I think it better I just talk about the bits that I actually want to talk about. Take for instance the continuation of my critique of these protagonists. Jacob and Evie Frye, as we've already gone over, represent polar opposite aspects to Assassin's Creed gameplay in their personalities. Jacob likes combat, Evie likes stealth, to simplify things perhaps a bit too much, and their early game flaw is that they don't think beyond that. As intended, Jacob is short-sighted with his actions, preferring action over thinking, and Evie doesn't really think for herself but rather sticks religiously to her father's teachings. And I suppose what Ubisoft Quebec were trying to go for here was to have Jacob rub off on Evie over the course of the story, and vice versa. The issue is that doesn't really happen, because the characters possess the foils to their own flaws. When Jacob realises the error in his own actions, he's more than capable of performing his own damage control, and his morals prevent him from actually crossing any lines. And though he's presented as a character who can't take things too seriously,
I'm sure he can put this to better use than I can.
Oh, what's this, Greenie? Assassin Christmas.
should the situation absolutely demand that, he absolutely can. Jacob isn't anywhere near as bad an assassin as the game tries to make him out to be, and so as a consequence of this not translating in the story beats so well, there are moments where he gets blamed for nonsense such as almost crashing the economy, even when he doesn't actually do a right lot wrong. As for Evie, she's meant to be the more level-headed and thinking character, and she most certainly is. However that thinking is the thinking imprinted on her by her father, whom unlike Jacob she holds on this ridiculous pedestal in her head. Now like I said, the game is trying to elaborate on how neither character has it all figured out, but the foil to Evie's flaw in this respect is she is actually right. And we never truly get a moment where Father Frye's teachings don't prove to have all the answers. Nonetheless, the story for her is her learning to rely on her own thinking, and that above all else does eventually get shifted to the background to facilitate entire sequences where we play just as Jacob, such as Sequence 8. They also really don't have the most convincing of sibling relationships between them. There are brief moments where they rib each other, otherwise they don't really share an awful lot of screen time, and their conversations towards the beginning of the game sound as if they are for the audience's sake rather than as a conversation that two siblings who grew up together would naturally have, and as a result it comes across as if they don't actually have any backstory and they've never actually met. In other words, their early game dialogue is at times a bit forced, and the meaningful interactions over the course of the narrative is limited. So there's a missed trick in these dual protagonists, because I don't think either character is particularly badly performed. I just didn't find them to have the most convincing of on-screen relationships, and that's a shame because under the surface of these characters there's a lot to like. Sure, their dialogue at times is a bit awkward when it wasn't intended to be, but neither character lacks for the potential for chemistry. There are just two protagonists in a game that doesn't take the time to satisfyingly deliver one. So the end result is the potential of neither character is truly explored in a way that can be considered adequate. Away from the main protagonists, another point I definitely want to raise are the villains. London is under the control of a ruthless Templar Grand Master named Crawford Starrick. He wasn't a real person, he's entirely fictional, simply because the game didn't want to offend the living descendants of real historical figures by portraying them as major antagonists, so many of the antagonists this game actually has are entirely fictional. Which is fine. There is nothing innately wrong with that. After all, at this point Templars are meant to be a secret society, so it makes sense that not all of their names have survived in history books and the like, but these villains can at times be a bit one-dimensional and their motivations are never truly explored. They just kind of exist. They come across a bit cartoony, and their distinguishing feature is their over-the-top aesthetic, which at times forgoes any modicum of subtlety. Furthermore, the villains are meant to be investigated, their true motivations uncovered, but at best they prove a nuisance to Evie as she pursues the Piece of Eden, the Shroud, in a race against time against Crawford Starrick, who's also after that, and Jacob's too preoccupied with liberating London, so whenever they show up it's for him to kill them. Yes, he kills them because he perceives them to be causing harm to the city, but the villains as characters aren't necessarily investigated, and once he finds out who he's killing, he kills them. As for Starrick, he isn't the most present villain I've ever seen. He does get moments between assassinating a target and the next sequence beginning, but I don't understand how we can view these considering the whole point of Assassin's Creed is we're reliving genetic memories. This implies that either Jacob or Evie is somehow remembering something they weren't present for. No matter, these cutscenes don't really demonstrate him as a threat, rather they just showcase that from some opulent albeit nondescript British office of some description, the Templars are scheming. Outside of one eavesdrop, there's no real interaction between Jacob and Evie Fry and Crawford Starrick, until of course the game's finale, and while we can gauge an awful lot from his personality here, which is far from a bad thing, I really don't understand why Starrick is delivered this way. As though this information is learned by us, it is not learned by either of our protagonists, and therefore does not necessarily immediately affect how Jacob and Evie go about doing what they're doing. This means Starrick never really changes his approach to more directly impact Jacob and Evie, and Jacob and Evie don't have any information to go off to alter their approach to bring the hurt to Starrick in any precise fashion. Oh, and he has an evil mustache, because of course he does. Now, I won't say that Starrick lacks for being compelling in the sense that he's completely flat, because he's certainly not. What he actually lacks over the course of the story is impact on the events. He's there, he's the villain, and that's understood, and we see his personality, but we truly needed more time dedicated to why he's after the Shroud. And he also needed to be present from the perspective of Jacob and Evie Fry a bit more. That way his influence over the twists and turns of London could actually be felt. The game does a lot of telling with this character, but not an awful lot of showing. Therefore, he's utterly irrelevant to the vast majority of the plot. In this setup, he becomes less of a character and more of a MacGuffin, just like the Piece of Eden he's pursuing. And I don't think that does justice to the performance the actor did, for one, as he makes no actions we can truly judge him for. He's an elusive phantom that we're chasing, but thanks to his own cutscenes completely irrelevant from the memories of Jacob and Evie, he just comes across as a guy. His name crops up, and there are things that are implied to be his doing, or because of him, but that's not really the same as him actually doing anything. Furthermore, these Starrick cutscenes actually elaborate his character as not being all that bad, if anything. He's a moderately exploitative, somewhat batshit crazy and murderous baron in a sea full of full-on exploitative barons, and what makes him our antagonist is A, the fact that he's a Templar, and B, the fact that he's after the Shroud of Eden, and that's it. Simply put, his character moments move in the opposite direction to the one you want for an antagonist. Sure, they demonstrate his jaded moral compass at times, but his presence as an individual threat is not elaborated at all. He virtually lets Jacob and Evie liberate London, and is only ever viewed reacting to their actions, but never actually directly taking action against them. To summarise, the interesting character is most certainly present, but his moments that tether him to the plot are tenuous. However, I wouldn't say the game constantly lacks for solid antagonistic presence. Evie has a nemesis in Lucy Thorne, who mirrors her pursuit and obsession over the Pieces of Eden, albeit for the betterment of the Templars. She is a bit over the top, but that is an interesting dynamic to play around with. She serves as Starrick's second-in-command and to an extent appears to function as his enforcer. Having that prove to be Evie's rival was quite a clever choice really, because her obsession, albeit differing in reason, is a commentary on how hyperfixating on the Pieces of Eden and by extension the future occurs at the expense of the present, which proves to be an apt lesson for Evie, as that issue applies to her. Falling flat perhaps because this is the only enemy Evie really has in the game. As for Jacob, his best foes are the ones that highlight the flaws in his brash nature. Take for example Pearl Attaway, whom Jacob strikes business ties with. Jacob doesn't actually realise that Pearl is a Templar, and thus she uses him to eliminate the competition of her bus business. So in Jacob's impulsive urge to gallivant and rid London of its Templar influence, in aiding Pearl he finds himself inadvertently aiding the Templars. An irony Pearl is rather amused by.
I was certain he knew that I belonged to the Order and was there to end me. Imagine my delight when he told me his true purpose. An assassin helping the Templar cause. Isn't that delicious?
It's sickening.
It's business, cousin.
Of course, with the truth discovered, Jacob is left with a mistake he needs to rectify. Pearl Attaway needs to die not exclusively because she's a Templar, but because Jacob's actions allowed her to be influential enough within her particular domain to be a threat, having helped her effectively monopolise the buses within the city. And sure, Jacob gets away with his errors the first time around, but the second time around came in the form of a character named Maxwell Roth, the leader of the Rook's rival gang, the Blighters. The game could easily have made him a blatantly antagonistic entity from jump and left it at that. However, instead it explores how Jacob and Maxwell Roth aren't all that different. Roth is a destructive force of nature, as is Jacob. He is a mirror that simply reflects Jacob Fry's destructive qualities, albeit far less checked. And so instead of the standoffish encounter you'd get between two rival gang leaders in a more traditional setting, here we have something of a sympathetic relationship where they relate to one another and even for a brief period work together. And it's in this brief friendship over the course of the game's penultimate sequence that Jacob is confronted with his own destructive nature, realising that being an assassin isn't just as simple as killing Templars, and his actions do have consequences. Roth's indifferent disposition to the suffering he causes is a realisation for Jacob for where the Rooks need to differ from the Blighters, and where he as the Rook's leader needs to differ from Roth, as should he fail to do so, Maxwell Roth may as well be an insight into his own future, one where his recklessness and indifference to consequences will inevitably lead to him becoming a crazed, dispassionate, bloodthirsty monster with the lack of inhibitions and resources necessary to plunge London into much deeper turmoil. Furthermore, Jacob realises there's more to addressing the woes of London than simply eliminating Templars, as Maxwell Roth is not a Templar. He's just a crime boss somewhat associated with Crawford Starrick, but that isn't why he does what he does. Nonetheless, he proves himself to be a threat we see Jacob commit here to not becoming himself, acknowledging that up until this point very little has separated him from that reality. Is it executed perfectly? No. But I can't ignore that Roth is a character that does force Jacob to develop, and in doing so he does serve the purpose of his caliber of antagonist quite nicely. A significant impact to Jacob's character is made here, and Jacob's flippant attitude towards consequence pivots, leaving genuine fear for what he might become, or what he might have already become, realising that if he truly wants to do good here, he can't just wantonly lay waste to London until the Blighters and the Templars are completely eradicated. Roth's positioning within the story and actions make Jacob a better assassin, and is a good example for how, though a lot of the antagonists in Assassin's Creed Syndicate can be a bit one-dimensional, perhaps even a bit cartoonish, the subject isn't a total write-off start to finish, and on top of that our main protagonists do undergo some degree of development, even if the game should have leaned into these aspects to a much, much greater degree. Side characters is another area where Syndicate does have a hard time. We've got Henry Green, who's certainly functional, but the vast majority of side characters are very momentary, shifting into the side content as swiftly as possible. Most don't have a recurring presence, though there are a few. For instance, Frederick Aberline shows up once in a while, and then of course Alexander Graham Bell helps out with the invention of a couple of tools that are incredibly useful, but then he too fades into obscurity, leaving behind what can only be taken as a worse version of Leonardo da Vinci from the Ezio trilogy, and this is one of the better interjections of a historical figure in the main storyline. Most are just thrown into throwaway encounters, before at the earliest convenience being relegated to side content, which in a lot of cases is kind of inevitable and certainly far better than never showing up again. But at times this can feel a bit unnecessary when the bulk of the game does lack for a broader scope of supporting characters outside of the main protagonists and antagonists, which is more of an issue than the characters coming and going being a problem, as that's actually to be expected if anything, especially considering this is an Assassin's Creed story. But considering the rapid pace of the narrative overall, it's very tricky for any supporting character to come in and leave any lasting mark whatsoever. But hey, at least it means this game has some stacked side content as far as historical figures are concerned. But sadly, story-wise, especially the early sequences, are too focused on cramming as many encounters with historical figures in as possible, that they're all shifted into the side content along with the bulk of the side characters, before the plot gets a chance to pick up, so we end up with a bit of a gaping hole. Away from the story at times, slipping into functioning as a historical celebrity meet and greet, I mentioned towards the start of the game that I didn't necessarily agree with this game's choice in tone, so I feel no need to reiterate that. But if there is something that I did find to be a bit awkward about Syndicate that I haven't mentioned yet, it's how this game conveys the passage of time, and that is that it doesn't. The entire main story takes place in the year 1868 and time appears to remain static. I can't really think of any major historical events that really occur, whether they be as part of the story or in the background, and that's really unusual for Assassin's Creed, as typically, even in the entries where the passage of time is a bit mucky, things are occurring and you get the feeling that time is in fact passing. Syndicate has nothing of the sort really to speak of, though day-night cycles are back. They were oddly not in Unity, so that's nice. But it's really strange that this game doesn't put any emphasis on time actually moving, particularly not in its story beats. You'd think liberating a city at the heart of an empire would take a good few years to accomplish. However, Assassin's Creed Syndicate seems to suggest it didn't take any more than a couple of months. We can infer this from an assassination that takes place towards the back end of the game, that of a fellow named Lord Cardigan, who unlike most of the villain crop was a real historical person. Lieutenant General James Thomas Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan, and 19 millionth Baron of pompous British aristocratic mouthful, passed away on the 28th of March 1868. So if this date is adhered to within Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and I'm not saying it is because the game does not specify and has taken liberties in that area in the past. Furthermore, Brudenell passed away in Northamptonshire, not London in real life, so it may not be the case, but in the event that it is, the entirety of Syndicate, at least up until this point, has to take place in a time frame as short as 3 months.
What a prick.
This makes the Fry Twins seem almost superhuman in their proactivity. If it's even faintly implied they've managed to successfully liberate the entirety of the heart of London in such a short time frame, it makes a molehill out of what should feel like a mountain. It's a very peculiar gripe to have, I'll be the first to say it, but it is something I certainly observe to be strange. As usually, whether we're involved with them or not, Assassin's Creed games are rife with historical events for us to gauge where we are in time. But there are no such glaring instances present in this one. Sure, there are mentions of events in the past and references to things that might happen in the future, but otherwise Syndicate's story occurs in a strange vacuum that is uncharacteristic of the series. Overall, Syndicate's story really is not its strongest aspect. It has its positives and its negatives, but ultimately it tries to do too much with 2 different characters without enough time really to make that worthwhile. For the most part, I can at least see what it was going for, but there are moments where even that gets lost, and its sense of humour is most certainly an acquired taste, one you either gel with or you don't. For me, it wasn't particularly easy to gel with, I won't lie, and it's with this where the idea that Assassin's Creed Syndicate is a bit of a parody of the series it belongs to begins to fester. But even that isn't as bad as I remember. Ultimately, I will say the plot has nothing inherently dreadful to it. However, on many of its key points, it could just have been so much more. I think it best I don't talk about the modern day. So let's shift on and talk about the side content, an area that saw at least some improvement over Unity's map full of bollocks approach. This is respectably a game where you can just storm through the main story if that's all you truly care about. but there are plenty of other bits and bats to be cracking on with on the side for those who want to look for it. Like Unity, it has its vapid world events and could easily be described as a collectathon at the best of times. Finding a way to implement solid side content has always been a struggle of the Assassin's Creed series, and beyond its collectibles, Syndicate doesn't really make a bad crack of it. Beyond the liberation missions that you have to engage with as part of the main story to an extent, this game does possess proper side missions, typically revolving around a side character, whether that be a made-up one or a historical figure. We can pick up missions from Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, Karl Marx, Queen Victoria herself, and so on. And these quests are typically relevant to the individuals giving them. There are some wacky ones in the mix, of course, but these missions typically expand upon the historical figures in the game. Marx, for instance, is all about looking out for the working man, and Dickens' missions appear to be about hunting ghosts, something it's documented he had a bit of an interest in. Take for instance the pursuit of Spring-Heeled Jack, an urban legend of sorts that arose during the Victorian era. Obviously, being Assassin's Creed, it can only get away with so much, so rather than pursuing a true malevolent entity, the investigation reveals a cult to be behind the murders that have been attributed to this Spring-Heeled Jack, allowing the explanation in this given example to not be too crazy. And this mission in particular showcases that if Syndicate wants to go darker, it's absolutely capable of doing that, and it just makes me yearn for more of it. And that's an itch this game's big DLC aimed to scratch, even if it does so with the subtlety of an ICBM. The Dickens missions prove themselves to be quite fun, a bit buggy at times, but a nice way to kill about half an hour. The Darwin missions focus on Charles Darwin relevant things. Just like the other side missions, these can be a bit temperamental if the game decides not to behave. For some reason the game's polish peels away spectacularly in them, but they still serve their purpose of expanding on the historical figures, so I can't complain. Altogether, this game's selection of side missions are quite fun. They don't necessarily scream of deeper mechanics, and sometimes they can be a bit buggy, but overall I really enjoyed engaging with them. There are of course other activities, such as a variety of robberies that occur across the map. After all, thanks to this game's gimmick, we're crime bosses, what would we do without a bit of crime? Then there's a variety of races that I didn't engage with because frankly they don't appeal to me. But one thing that did of course appeal to me is the Fight Club. They're straightforward fights. If you survive to the end without giving up or being knocked out, you get a lot of money, and that's about it. Otherwise, aside from the prevalence of shirtlessness, they aren't that dissimilar from combat overall, at least with the brass knuckles. However, you can only rely on the fundamental combat as you have no tools at your disposal, because that would be naughty. I do find it funny, however, that on the map these icons will specify your personal best, because that round is typically the last round you can do, but ultimately whether you view the fight clubs as good or bad will boil entirely down to whether or not you actually enjoy this game's combat. For me, it's nice because it's a lot more relaxed to fight in the clubs than it is to actually fight on the street. There's a lot less chaos occurring. These are great for familiarising yourself with how the combat actually works above all else, but if you don't find Syndicate's combat fun at all, you won't find these fun either. Nonetheless, they are there if you need to kill 20 minutes of time or whatever. Collectible wise, like Unity before it, there is of course a metric shit ton. The icons are admittedly less invasive on the map zoomed out, but there is plenty to collect if the simple satisfaction of collecting things is your thing. There are people who like it, and sometimes, I have to admit, I like it. I wouldn't ever want it to be all there is, but there is pleasure to take in mindlessly gathering. I shan't mention the Dickens and Darwin conspiracy, the dreadful crimes, or the last Maharaja here, because those are DLC. But there is one more piece of side content in the base game that stood a greater chance than the rest at being mind-blowing. You see, on the world map's eastern boundary, we can find a portal to World War I, a glitch in the Animus that, should we engage with it, plucks us from Victorian London and transports us to a portion of the city during the First World War, where we play as Jacob Fry's granddaughter Lydia. Unlike Unity's Animus glitch moments where Arno is transported to different time periods for a series of brief set pieces, Syndicate's World War I segment is an open space that we can leave and return to at any time. And our job here, simply put, is to thwart some spies, at the behest of none other than a young Winston Churchill, history's favourite avid cigar extraordinaire. And true to form, He's always seen with a cigar in hand here, and he tasks us with rooting out a master spy who happens to be a sage, which means there's plenty of Juno being a disembodied talking head atop Tower Bridge, giving us passing paragraphs about the first civilization, which when you think about it is an incredibly specific itch to scratch, especially for a character set up to be the series' overarching main antagonist only to be killed off in a comic book, and I do apologise but I don't suspect I'll ever be capable of letting that go. But the point is, it was of course Juno who brought us in here in the first place, but why I'm still not entirely sure, and we find ourselves confronted with a new region to liberate and an ever so slightly spiced up World War I flavour of Assassin's Creed gameplay, where not an awful lot is changed. We have a new protagonist to familiarise ourselves with. She doesn't have enough screen time to actually be interesting, but the thought is what counts, I suppose. We get to shoot down some planes with boat-mounted machine guns, which appears to be a mechanic that Unity utilised as well in one of its segments, and just like in Unity, it's a nice break here from Syndicate's loop, but the vast majority of the gameplay loop of Assassin's Creed Syndicate remains entirely unmolested. There are some new character models, the aesthetic is different, World War I London is a different sight for the eyes to gaze upon, and if I'm being entirely honest, it looks really good and also suits the tone that I think the rest of Syndicate should have gone for a bit more. And while the content here is really generic open space stuff, the memory items are a really nice collectible that tell the stories of people who lived during the First World War. And the world space design, despite this being such a throwaway piece of side content, is incredibly good. However, the bulk of the actual gameplay substance by Syndicate standards is really nothing special. Neither is its self-contained story awfully interesting, simply rehashing Assassin's Creed lore we already know. Nonetheless, back in 2015 it had enough going for it for my jaw to completely hit the floor, because I didn't expect this World War I segment to be a thing at all. So I've had a lasting appreciation for the World War I segment of Assassin's Creed Syndicate over the years, because it's a clear example of Ubisoft actually caring to shake things up, even if they only shake things up marginally. But people often refer to this as their favourite segment of Syndicate, and while I perceive that as often being swept up in the gravitas of being transported to a different time, of course I can see why that would be intoxicating. All in all, Syndicate doesn't have a bad crop of side content, but it is nothing special. To conclude this video, and looking at the timecode you're probably begging me to, Assassin's Creed Syndicate is a strange game. Sandwiched between Unity and Origins meant its purpose wasn't really to innovate, nor was it trying to be the best experience in the franchise to date. It was simply to fill the gap between Unity and its negative reception, and the series reinventing itself with Origins, whether that be the right type of reinvention or not. And so the end result is a game that could only really be described as Unity, but more polished. Everything this game does is fairly safe, and everything it does as a result works. It's not bad at all, but the problem is it doesn't do anything to really stand out all that much. It's a full, competent game, but its innovations are purely to resolve problems presented by the setting, i.e. the rope launcher or grapple hook. The characters are fine, the plot is serviceable, the side content is mildly enjoyable, and the gang gimmick is a gimmick, alright. But it could have done so much more had Ubisoft not treated it as a PR placating exercise in wake of Unity and its rather troubled opening months. Assassin's Creed Syndicate was a game where there didn't need to be one, as eyes were squarely focused on the massive transformation of Origins. But to an extent I'm glad Syndicate was there, because it isn't entirely devoid of value. Yes, it is a game that could have been so much more, but what it isn't doesn't make what it is any lesser. Victorian London is well worth exploring, the rope launcher was well worth a go, the gang gimmick was well worth a crack as well. Despite not striving to be a peak of the series, there's no denying that Syndicate had a unique identity, even if that identity didn't make it stand out within the franchise. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, Syndicate gets some points for being the final game to adhere to the old Assassin's Creed formula. It was the last entry to the series that we could comfortably judge based on how well it tried to be itself, rather than the evasive criteria of future installments. And while I'd argue that's a little more than a neutral point, the simplicity of it is refreshing, especially today. And on that point, there's a lot of added flesh this game could have done with, but its biggest flaw was the strangely upbeat tone against the backdrop of perhaps one of the most oppressive cities at the time. And that's really where the idea of this feeling like a parody of Assassin's Creed stems from. But I don't think it was actually trying to mock the series, as it certainly has its darker moments that are more fitting for the setting it belongs to, And it's in these moments that Assassin's Creed Syndicate feels like it comes together to a higher degree than the rest of the thing, and I certainly came away from this long overdue revisit with a yearning for more of that. So I suppose we'll have to see how my opinions have changed, or haven't, on the Jack the Ripper expansion. But to tie off the main game, I'm glad I finally got around to revisiting it. It had been years since I last played it. I think it was during lockdown that I sat down and played the last Maharaja DLC, as I'd never actually done that before, and that was the best part of 5 years ago. But now, being removed from my younger self's obsession with this franchise, I found myself in a position where I feel I can appreciate its merits better. And I wouldn't say it's by any means a spectacular game, but it's far from a bad one either. For the most part, I've found myself enjoying playing it, and what else does a game need to do? And so on that I leave you, but thank you all for watching. I really hope that you've enjoyed this one. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. It would be massively appreciated. Perhaps even check out my revisiting video on Origins if you enjoyed this hour-long slog. But above all else, with any luck, I hope to see you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, please take care and goodbye.